The cold was a constant companion, a cruel lover that sank its teeth into her bones and refused to let go. Alara's fingers were numb, the raw red of her knuckles a stark contrast against the grimy stone floor she scrubbed. Each push of the stiff, bristled brush sent a fresh wave of agony up her arms, a familiar fire that did little to warm her. This was her life. Cold, pain, and the scent of lye mixed with the damp chill of the packhouse dungeons. They called her Omega, a title that meant less than nothing. She was the dirt under their claws, the shadow in the corner, the repository for all their casual cruelties. An orphan left on the pack's doorstep 18 winters ago, she had never known a kind word or a gentle touch. She was a burden, a ghost haunting the edges of their vibrant, powerful lives. Her stomach twisted with a hunger so deep it had become a part of her. The others would be feasting in the great hall now, their laughter echoing down the stone corridors, a sound as alien to her as the warmth of the sun. She would get the scraps, if she was lucky. If she finished her chores before the pack beta, Garrick, decided she needed another lesson in obedience. A sharp kick landed squarely in her ribs, stealing the air from her lungs. "Still alive down there, mutt?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with poison. She stood over Alara, her fine leather boots practically glowing in the gloom, a stark reminder of the status Alara would never have. Alara gasped, curling into herself as pain blossomed in her side. She didn't answer. Answering was an invitation for more. Lyra sneered, nudging Alara's pail with the toe of her boot. Soapy, freezing water sloshed over the side, soaking the thin tunic on Alara's legs. The cold intensified, biting with renewed venom. Pathetic. I don't know why the Alpha even lets you breathe our air. Behind Lyra, Garrick lounged against the wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was handsome, in a harsh, predatory way that made her skin crawl. He had once looked at her with something other than disdain, for a fleeting moment last summer, but that had passed as quickly as a mayfly's life. Now, his eyes held only contempt. "She's a stain on the pack's honor," Garrick drawled, his gaze sweeping over her with theatrical disgust. "Look at her. Filthy. Weak. Utterly worthless." The word struck her harder than the kick. Worthless. It was the name she called herself in the darkest hours of the night, the truth she could never escape. Lyra laughed, a tinkling, ugly sound. She picked up a small, steaming pot from a tray a lesser servant was holding. "Here, let me help you clean up." With a flick of her wrist, she poured the contents onto Alara's back. Searing heat, a shocking counterpoint to the pervasive cold, exploded across her skin. Alara screamed, a raw, choked sound torn from her throat. The pain was blinding, a liquid fire that erased all thought. She thrashed on the wet stone, trying to escape the agony. "That's enough, Lyra," Garrick said, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Boredom? In his voice. "Don't kill it. The Alpha needs the floors cleaned." Lyra pouted, dropping the pot with a clatter. "Fine." She gave Alara one last, vicious kick. "Finish your work, Omega." They swept away, their laughter trailing behind them, leaving Alara alone with her pain. Tears mixed with the dirty water on her cheeks. The burn on her back was already beginning to throb in time with her frantic heartbeat. The cold was seeping back in, a merciless tide. But as she lay there, trembling and broken, a tiny, stubborn ember refused to be extinguished in the core of her being. She would not die here. She would not let them win. Gritting her teeth against the agony, she pushed herself up. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her skin felt like it was peeling away. But she got to her hands and knees. She picked up the brush. Her hand trembled, but her grip was firm. She dipped the brush back into the freezing water and began to scrub, each movement a defiant act. They could hurt her. They could starve her. But they could not break her. Not completely. That night, huddled in her tiny windowless cell that was more of a closet than a room, she shivered under a threadbare blanket. The burn on her back was a blistering torment, and the bruises on her ribs ached with every shallow breath. She had not been given any scraps. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the image of a forest in summer, a fantasy she often used to escape. The scent of warm pine, the feeling of soft moss underfoot, the dappled sunlight on her skin. It was a world away from this cold stone prison, a world she would never know. A sudden, deafening roar from the great hall shattered her fragile peace. It was Alpha Valerius. His rages were legendary, violent storms that swept through the pack house, leaving destruction in their wake. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded down the corridor towards her cell. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. What now? What had she done? The bolt on her door was thrown back with a deafening clang. 2 broad-shouldered enforcers filled the doorway, their faces grim. They grabbed her by the arms, their grips like iron bands, and hauled her from the room. She stumbled, her bare feet scraping against the rough stone. They dragged her up the stairs and into the chaos of the great hall. The long tables were overturned, food was scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all stood Alpha Valerius, his face purple with fury, his eyes blazing. "There she is," he snarled, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at her. "The source of all our misfortune." Confusion warred with her terror. What was he talking about? "The tribute for the winter conclave. It was rejected," he spat, his voice shaking with rage. "The emissary from the Alpha King said our offering was tainted, unworthy. He said a blight of dishonor hangs over this pack." He took a step closer, his massive form radiating menace. "And it started when you were left on our doorstep." It was insane, a mad justification for his own failures. But the pack, riled and fearful, needed a scapegoat, and she was the perfect target. "You are a curse, Omega," Valerius bellowed, his voice bouncing off the high rafters. "You have brought this shame upon us, and we will be clean of you." He raised his hand, and the hall fell silent. The wind howled outside, a rising gale that rattled the shutters. A storm was coming, a bad one. "You have 1 hour, the Alpha declared, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. 1 hour to be off my lands. If you are found within our borders after that, my hunters will track you down and tear you apart. Now go." The enforcers shoved her toward the main doors. She stumbled, catching herself on a splintered table leg. A death sentence. It was a death sentence. The storm was already a blizzard, a wall of white beyond the doors. No one could survive that. She looked around the room, a desperate, silent plea in her eyes. She saw Lyra smiling, a triumphant, vicious little smirk. She saw Garrick, his expression unreadable but devoid of any pity. She saw 100 faces, all hard, all cold, all condemning her. No one would help her. She was truly, finally, alone. With a sob caught in her throat, she turned and ran. She burst through the heavy oak doors and into the teeth of the blizzard. The wind sliced at her like 1,000 icy claws, stealing her breath and blinding her with a vortex of snow. Her thin tunic was useless against the assault. The cold was immediate, absolute, a physical blow that staggered her. She had no coat, no boots, no food, only the burning on her back, the ache in her ribs, and the crushing weight of despair. But the ember of defiance still flickered. She would not die on their doorstep. She forced her legs to move, plunging into the white chaos of the forest. The packlands were vast. An hour would barely get her to the edge of the first ridge. It was hopeless. Still, she ran. Branches whipped at her face, leaving stinging cuts. Her bare feet were already numb, stumbling over hidden roots and sharp stones she could not feel. The world was a roaring, white void. There was no up, no down, only the screaming wind and the punishing cold. Was this it? Was this how her worthless life ended? A frozen corpse in a ditch, forgotten by everyone. The thought brought a fresh wave of tears, which froze instantly on her lashes. She pushed the thought away. She focused on the next step, and the next. Her lungs burned. Her body was screaming, a symphony of pain and exhaustion. The burn on her back had gone numb, a dead weight of agony. She did not know how long she ran. Minutes? An hour? Time had lost all meaning. She was just a small, desperate creature, fleeing a fate that was already closing in around her. She felt the ground give way beneath her. A sharp crack, and then nothing. She was falling. Ice-cold water enveloped her, a shock so profound it felt like being burned all over again. The river. She had stumbled onto the frozen river. The current was a brutal, unseen force, dragging her down, pulling her under the sheet of ice. Panic exploded in her chest. She clawed at the water, her numb fingers finding no purchase. Her lungs were bursting. The darkness was pulling at the edge of her vision. The cold was no longer just outside her. It was inside, filling her, extinguishing the last of her fight. So this was it. Drowning in the freezing dark. Just as her consciousness began to fade, a powerful hand clamped around her arm. It was like being seized by a granite vice. With impossible strength, she was hauled upward, breaking through the surface with a desperate gasp. Air filled her lungs, painful and life-giving. She was dragged from the water and onto the snowy bank, where she collapsed, coughing and shivering uncontrollably. She looked up at her rescuer, and the breath she had just regained was stolen away again. He was massive, a silhouette of raw power against the swirling snow. Broad shoulders, a frame built for war and rule, cloaked in dark, rich furs. His face was all harsh angles and predatory beauty, framed by a mane of night-black hair dusted with snow. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They glowed, a soft, internal luminescence, the color of molten gold. They were ancient, powerful, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that stripped her bare. He was injured. A deep gash ran along his side, his dark tunic stained black with blood that steamed in the frigid air. He seemed to be leaning heavily on a nearby tree, as if standing was an effort. Who was he? What was he? Her shivering intensified, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Her wet clothes were already freezing to her skin. She was going to die right here, at the feet of this impossible stranger. He grunted, a low sound deep in his chest, and pushed himself away from the tree. He knelt before her, his golden eyes scanning her from head to toe. A strange expression crossed his face. Not pity, but something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. "You are freezing," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like thunder rolling through distant mountains. It vibrated through her, a strange warmth in the all-consuming cold. He reached out, his large hand moving toward her face. Instinct, born of a lifetime of abuse, took over. She flinched back, squeezing her eyes shut, bracing for a blow. But the blow never came. Instead, she felt the rough texture of his glove gently brush the frozen tears from her cheek. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, it shattered her composure. A broken sob escaped her lips. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He looked from his hand to her face, a flicker of confusion in his golden gaze. He made a move to stand, to help her up, but a wave of dizziness seemed to wash over him. He staggered, his hand going to the wound in his side. He needed help. The thought was absurd. She was the one dying. But seeing this powerful being falter stirred something in her, that stubborn spark that refused to die. "There's a cave," she chattered, her voice barely a whisper. She had seen it on her desperate flight. A dark slash in the rock face not far from the river. Shelter. He looked in the direction she indicated, then back at her. He gave a single sharp nod. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms. The movement was surprisingly gentle. He held her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. The heat of his body was a staggering shock, a furnace against her frozen skin. It felt good. Too good. She was too weak, too cold, too confused to protest. She buried her face against the fur of his cloak, inhaling the scent of pine, winter storms, and something else, something wild and uniquely him. He carried her through the blizzard, his long strides sure and steady despite his injury. He found the cave easily, a dark opening partially hidden by snow-laden firs. Inside, it was shielded from the wind, the oppressive silence a stark contrast to the storm's howl. He set her down gently near the back of the cave. The darkness was near total, but his glowing eyes provided a faint, golden illumination. "I need to make a fire," he stated, his voice tight with pain. She watched as he moved with grim determination, gathering dry twigs and moss from a recess in the rock. His movements were economical, precise, but she could see the strain in his face. The gash in his side was bleeding sluggishly, a dark stain spreading across his clothes. He needed his wound cleaned. He had saved her life. She had to try to help him. "Let me," she whispered, her voice still trembling. He paused, looking at her, his golden eyes unreadable in the gloom. He didn't argue. He simply handed her the flint and steel he produced from a pouch at his belt. Her fingers were clumsy, still numb, but she focused, scraping the flint against the steel. A spark. Another. Finally, a tiny spark caught in the tinder-dry moss. She blew on it gently, coaxing the fragile flame, feeding it tiny twigs until a small, cheerful fire began to crackle, pushing back the oppressive cold and darkness. The firelight danced across his harsh features, throwing shadows that made him look even more formidable. He had stripped off his heavy outer cloak and was now trying to assess the damage to his side, his face a mask of pain. "Let me see," she said again, a little bolder this time. She crawled closer. The warmth from the fire was beginning to penetrate her frozen limbs, bringing with it 1,000 pricking needles of sensation. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, shifting to give her a better view. The wound was long and deep, the edges ragged. It looked like it had been made by some monstrous claw. It was dirty, full of grime and what looked like black dust. It needed to be cleaned, or it would fester. "My tunic," she began, looking down at her own frozen, filthy rags. Useless. He seemed to understand. He reached to the hem of his own tunic, the fine, dark wool surprisingly clean on the inside. With a grunt of effort, he tore a long strip from the bottom. "Use this." She took the fabric. It was warm from his body. She needed water, but all she had was the snow outside. She took another strip of the fabric and packed it with clean snow from a drift near the cave mouth, then held it near the fire to melt. He watched her every move, his silence unnerving. She could feel his golden gaze on her, intense and unwavering. It made her hands shake. When the cloth was damp with melted snow, she took a deep breath and turned back to him. "This will hurt." "I have endured worse," he rumbled. She believed him. She gently, tentatively, began to clean the wound. He didn't flinch, but a muscle in his jaw tightened and his breath hissed between his teeth. The black dust seemed to cling to his flesh, and she had to scrub harder than she wanted to, her own stomach churning at the sight. Her fingers were clumsy, and as she reached to wipe away a smear of blood near the top of the gash, her bare hand brushed against the unblemished skin of his stomach. The world exploded. A bolt of pure energy, white-hot and blinding, shot up her arm. It was not a burn. It was something else entirely. Something primal and electric. It slammed into her chest, and for a second, she thought her heart had stopped. A scream was torn from her throat, raw and full of shock, but it was drowned out by his own guttural roar of agony and surprise. His eyes flared, the molten gold turning into blazing silver suns. The cave was lit as if by lightning. The power that surged between them was a physical thing, a crackling, violent storm contained within the small space. And then came the pain. It was a searing, branding heat on her left shoulder. It was excruciating, 1,000 times worse than Lyra's scalding water. It felt like a star was being born under her skin, burning its way through flesh and bone. She collapsed backward, clutching at her shoulder, writhing on the cave floor as tears of pure agony streamed down her face. Through the haze of her own torment, she saw him. He was clutching his chest, his head thrown back, his body rigid. The silver light in his eyes slowly faded back to gold, but they were wide with a shocking, profound understanding. The burning on her shoulder began to coalesce, to sharpen into a specific shape. The pain lessened from a supernova to a bearable, throbbing fire. She risked a glance. Through a tear in her tunic, she saw it. Etched onto her skin, glowing with a soft, silvery light of its own, was a mark. It was an intricate, perfect snowflake, each crystalline branch impossibly detailed. It seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, a permanent brand of starlight and frost. What was happening to her? What was this? She looked up at the stranger, her fear a living thing in her throat. He had pushed himself up and was staring at her, at the mark on her shoulder. The pain was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of such bone-deep, soul-shaking awe that it terrified her more than his anger would have. He moved toward her, not with the predatory grace of before, but with a slow, reverent caution, as if approaching a thing so fragile it might shatter. "You," he breathed, the single word full of centuries of waiting, of searching, of loneliness. "It's you." She scrambled backward, trying to put distance between them, her mind reeling. "What did you do to me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with pain and terror. "I did nothing," he said, his voice softer now, but with an undercurrent of absolute certainty that chilled her to the bone. "The bond. It has been forged." He reached a hand toward her, not to touch, but as if to show her he was unarmed. "I have you." His words made no sense. Bond? What bond? He sounded like he was speaking a language she should know but didn't. All she knew was the throbbing brand on her skin and the terrifying pull she felt toward him, an invisible cord that seemed to stretch between them, humming with a power she couldn't comprehend. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of pain, screamed at her to run, flee, escape. But her body wanted to move closer. It yearned for his presence, for the strange, grounding heat of him. It was a war within herself, her mind terrified, her soul drawn. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head. "I don't know you." A smile touched his lips for the first time. It was not a happy smile. It was sad, ancient, and achingly beautiful. It was the smile of a man who had been lost in a desert for a lifetime and had just found his first drop of water. "You will," he said, his voice a solemn vow. "I am Kaelin, and you are mine." Mine. The word was possessive, absolute. It should have sent her running for the hills, but instead, it resonated deep inside her, in the place where the bond had taken root. It felt right, and that scared her more than anything. Section S. Section. She was property, an omega, a curse. She had never belonged to anyone, had never been wanted. This man, this Kaelin, spoke as if he had a right to her, as if she was a treasure he had just unearthed. It was too much. "I belong to no one," she managed to say, the words a weak echo of the defiance she once felt. Kaelin's gaze softened. "You do not belong to me," he corrected gently, his voice rumbling with a patience that seemed as vast as the mountains. "You belong with me. There is a difference." He gestured to the glowing mark on her shoulder. "That is a soul bond, a claiming. It marks you as my mate, my queen." Queen? The word was so absurd she almost laughed, a hysterical, broken sound. Her? A queen? She was Alara the worthless, Alara the cursed. She was filth and rags and pain. "You're mistaken," she whispered, pulling the torn fabric of her tunic over the mark, as if hiding it would make it disappear. I'm nothing. An omega from a disgraced pack." "I am the Alpha King," he stated simply, as if that explained everything. "I do not make mistakes of this magnitude." Alpha King. The title slammed into her. Valerius's words came rushing back. The emissary from the Alpha King. This was him. The ultimate ruler of all packs, the ancient power whose name was only spoken in whispers. And he was sitting in a cave with her, bleeding, claiming her as his mate. The world tilted on its axis. This was a dream, a hallucination brought on by cold and pain. It had to be. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice soft but absolute. He gestured to the spot by the fire opposite him. "You are still freezing, and I am not your enemy." Hesitantly, she obeyed. The pull of his authority was as tangible as the pull of the bond. She sat, wrapping her arms around her knees, never taking her eyes off him. The fire crackled between them. The storm still raged outside. For a long moment, there was only silence. It was a heavy silence, filled with a million unspoken questions. "I have been searching for you for over 300 years, Kaelin said finally, his golden gaze fixed on the flames. "Our line, the soul bond, is rare. It chooses its own time. I had begun to believe I would rule and die alone." 300 years. The number was incomprehensible. He looked no older than 30. "Why me?" she asked, the question a raw whisper. "There's nothing special about me." It was the core truth of her existence, the one thing she knew for sure. He finally looked at her, and the raw loneliness in his eyes broke her heart. "That is where you are wrong. The bond doesn't form with just anyone. It connects to a soul of equal and complementary strength. You are not nothing, little one. You are a fire hidden in the frost. I felt it the moment our skin touched." Hope, a terrifying and unfamiliar emotion, began to flicker within her. Could it be true? Could she be more than the sum of her scars? Before she could process the thought, a sound from outside the cave shattered the fragile moment. A twig snapped. It was too sharp, too deliberate to be an animal. Kalen was on his feet in an instant, his pain forgotten. He moved to the mouth of the cave, every line of his body screaming predator. He held a finger to his lips, his golden eyes narrowed. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Voices, muffled by the wind, drifted toward them. "Saw her run this way. The tracks end at the river." Alara's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Garrick. "She couldn't have survived the fall," another voice said. "Let's go back, Garrick. The Alpha will have our hides if we're caught in this storm." "No." Garrick's voice was a low snarl, full of frustration. "She's mine to punish." "The little wretch thinks she can defy the Alpha and just run off? I'll drag her back by her hair." Kalen shot her a look, a question in his eyes. She gave a tiny, terrified shake of her head. These were not rescuers. They were her tormentors. His jaw hardened. He was still injured, weakened from the bonding. He was in no shape to fight. "Stay back," he murmured, positioning himself in the shadows just inside the cave entrance. The footsteps grew closer. A moment later, 2 figures appeared, their forms dark against the swirling white. It was Garrick and another enforcer from her pack. "There's a cave here," Garrick said, his voice laced with triumph. "Knew it. The little rat would look for shelter." He strode into the cave as if he owned it, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the gloom. He saw her first, huddled by the fire. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what we have here. Thought you could escape me, did you?" Then his eyes landed on Kalen. Garrick froze, his bravado vanishing in an instant. He was looking at a power he couldn't comprehend, but he recognized its lethality. He instinctively took a step back. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice tight. Kalen didn't answer. He simply stared, his golden eyes promising death. Garrick's gaze darted back to Alara. He saw the tear in her tunic, the unnatural, faint silver glow coming from her shoulder. His eyes widened. He didn't know what the mark was, but he recognized it as something significant. Something that made her more than just the Pax Omega. It made her a prize. "What is that?" he hissed, taking a step toward her. "What did you do to her?" "You will not touch her." Kalen's voice was a low growl, a promise of violence. Greed and jealousy warred in Garrick's face. He had cast her aside as worthless, and now this powerful stranger had marked her, claimed her. The injustice of it, in his twisted mind, was infuriating. "She is of my pack," Garrick snarled, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of dominance. "She belongs to us. We're taking her back." He lunged, not for Kalen, but for Alara. It was a fatal mistake. Even injured, Kalen moved like lightning. He met Garrick's charge with a brutal shove that sent him flying backward into the snow. The other enforcer, seeing his companion so easily dispatched, drew a knife. Before he could take a single step, a new voice, cold and amused, echoed from the blizzard. My, What a lively little party. A third figure emerged from the storm. This one was tall and slender, wrapped in black robes that seemed to absorb the light. His face was pale and aristocratic, his smile a thin, cruel slash. His eyes were empty voids, pits of shadow that promised nothing but oblivion. Kaelin stiffened, a true snarl ripping from his chest this time. Malignus. The name dripped with ancient hatred. The Shadow King, Malignus, chuckled, a sound like grinding stone. Kaelin, I thought I smelled your blood on the wind. My pet did a fine job, it seems. A pity it didn't finish you. His gaze slid past Kaelin and landed on Alara. It lingered on the glowing mark on her shoulder. His smile widened. Oh, this is a surprise. After all these centuries, you finally found her, the long-lost queen, and on the very day I came to hunt you. Fate does have a delicious sense of irony. Garrick and his companion were frozen, caught between two terrifying mythical powers. They were hopelessly out of their league. Get out of my way, shadow spawn, Kaelin growled, stepping in front of Alara, shielding her with his body. I think not, Malignus said smoothly. I came for a king, but finding a queen is so much more valuable. He flicked his wrist. Tendrils of pure darkness erupted from the snow, snaking around Garrick and the other enforcer. The men screamed, a choked, gurgling sound, before the shadows solidified into black ice, encasing them completely. They were statues of frozen terror. Alara stared in horror. He had killed them without a thought, without even a touch. Malignus then turned his full attention to Kaelin. You are weak, old wolf. Your wound, the bonding. You can barely stand. This will be easier than I thought. More shadow tendrils shot forward, aiming for Kaelin. The Alpha King met them with a roar, batting them aside, but the effort cost him. He staggered, sweat beading on his brow. He was fading, and fast. Alara felt a wave of pure terror. He was going to lose. This shadow man was going to kill him. No! She cried out, though she didn't know what she could possibly do. Her cry seemed to distract Malignus for a fraction of a second. It was all he needed. With a flick of his fingers, a whip of darkness lashed out, not at Kaelin, but at her. It wrapped around her waist, cold and suffocating. It lifted her from her feet and dragged her out of the cave, away from Kaelin, away from the fire's warmth. Alara! Kaelin's roar was full of fury and despair. He lunged for her, but another wall of shadows slammed into him, throwing him back against the cave wall. He crumpled to the ground, his golden eyes wide with helplessness. Don't worry, Kaelin, Malignus purred, pulling her closer to him. The cold of the shadow whip was seeping into her, a deep, soul-draining chill. I'll take very good care of your little queen. She is the key to everything, after all. The world began to spin. The last thing she saw was Kaelin's agonized face, his mouth open in a silent roar of her name, before the darkness claimed her completely. She awoke to pain, not the sharp pain of a burn or a bruise, but a deep, hollow ache that seemed to emanate from her very soul. It was a tearing sensation, a constant, agonizing pull, as if a vital part of her was being stretched to its breaking point. The bond. It was the bond. The distance from Kaelin was a physical torment. She was in a cell. The walls were obsidian, smooth and cold, seeming to drink the light from the single torch flickering outside the bars. The air was frigid and smelled of ozone and decay. Around her wrists were heavy cuffs of cold black iron. They felt dead, sucking the warmth and what little strength she had from her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled to the bars, pulling at them fruitlessly. "Kaylin!" His name was a ragged gasp. There was no answer, only the echo of her own voice in the suffocating silence. She could feel him, though, a faint, distant thread of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness of the bond. He was alive, but he was in pain. His agony mirrored her own, a desperate, frantic searching across the miles that separated them. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself. The silver snowflake on her shoulder was dim, its light barely a flicker. It felt cold against her skin. Despair washed over her, a black, suffocating tide. She had been found only to be lost. She had been given a glimpse of hope, of worth, only to have it ripped away and replaced with this living nightmare. Garrick's word echoed in her mind. Worthless. Maybe he was right. She was just a pawn, a key, a thing to be used and broken. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Malignus appeared before her cell, his shadowy form seeming to warp the torchlight around him. He smiled his thin, cruel smile. "Awake, I see. Good. I was worried the transit might have frayed you." "What do you want with me?" she asked, her voice trembling but laced with a sliver of defiance. "What I have always wanted," he said, pacing before the bars. "Power. Kaylin's throne. For centuries, the Alpha King has been a bulwark of light and order, a tedious obstacle to my ambitions. But he has a weakness, a flaw in his design, the soul bond." He stopped and looked at her, his void-like eyes seeming to see straight through her. "The bond is a source of immense strength, but it is also a vulnerability. A shared soul means a shared fate. What happens to one affects the other. You, my dear little queen, are a knife I can press against his heart from 100 leagues away." He gestured to the dim mark on her shoulder. "I am going to perform a ritual, a severing. I will use your own connection to him as a conduit, and I will shatter the bond that makes him who he is. It will break his spirit, cripple his power. And once he is a hollow shell, I will march into his precious kingdom and take it for myself." The casual cruelty of his plan stole her breath. He would use the most beautiful, miraculous thing that had ever happened to her as a weapon to destroy the one person who had ever shown her kindness. "You won't succeed," she spat, the words tasting like ash. "He will find me." Malignus laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, I have no doubt he will try. But he is wounded, weakened. And by the time he gets here, it will be too late. The ritual begins at moonrise." He turned and walked away, his dark robes melting into the shadows. Moonrise. She had hours, at most. The tearing sensation of the bond intensified, and she cried out, clutching her chest. It was unbearable. She was fraying, just as he'd said, coming apart at the seams. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by pain and hopelessness. She was going to die here. He was going to die because of her. She was a curse, after all. No, the word was not her own. It was a faint whisper in the back of her mind, a spark of warmth in the cold. It was deep, resonant, and utterly familiar. "Kaylin?" she thought, her own mind reaching out into the void, clinging to that tiny spark. "Hold on." His voice came again, stronger this time, a telepathic touch across the agonizing distance. It was laced with his own pain, but underneath it was a foundation of unshakable will. "I feel you. I know where you are. Hold on, Alara." Her name. He said her name. It was the first time she had heard it from his lips. In his mind voice, it sounded like a prayer. "I'm coming," he promised. The connection was a lifeline, a thread of gold in the suffocating darkness. "Do not let him break you. You are the heart of winter, the fire in the frost. You are stronger than you know." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of a desperate, burgeoning hope. He was coming. He believed in her. She had to hold on. She focused on his presence, on the golden thread of their bond. It was still painful, still stretched thin, but it was there. It was real. She wrapped her consciousness around it, guarding it, feeding it with her own stubborn resilience. Hours passed. The torchlight outside her cell began to wane. The air grew colder. She knew moonrise was approaching. Two of Malignus's guards, creatures of shadow and malice, came for her. They unlocked her cell and dragged her from it, her bare feet scraping on the freezing stone floor. They led her up a winding staircase and into a vast, circular chamber. The ceiling was open to the night sky, where a full, mercilessly white moon hung. In the center of the chamber was a complex ritual circle, drawn in what looked like powdered silver and blood. Malignus stood at its heart, waiting for her. "Welcome, little queen," he said with a theatrical bow. "Just in time." The guards forced her into the center of the circle, chaining her iron-cuffed wrists to stone pillars on either side. She was spread-eagled, helpless, the moon shining down on her, illuminating the dim snowflake on her shoulder. Malignus began to chant, his voice a low, guttural drone that made the air vibrate. The lines of the circle began to glow with a sickly red light. The pain in her soul intensified 100-fold. The bond was screaming, a high, keening wail of pure agony. It was being torn, shredded, unraveled by his dark magic. She screamed, her head thrown back as the feeling of Kalen, his warmth, his presence, began to fade. It was like dying. It was worse than dying. "Kalen!" she cried out in her mind, a last, desperate plea. Just as she felt the final thread of their connection about to snap, the entire fortress shook. An earth-shattering roar, the sound of 1,000 winter storms given voice, ripped through the night. It was a sound of pure, untamed rage. It was the roar of an alpha king. One of the chamber walls exploded inward, showering the room with stone and debris, and through the dust and chaos, he came. Kalen stood there, his golden eyes blazing with righteous fury. He was no longer the wounded man from the cave. He was a god of wrath. Behind him stood a legion of his warriors, their own eyes glowing, their forms massive and terrifying. "Malignus!" Kalen's voice was a tidal wave of power that shook the very foundations of the keep. "You will release my queen! Now!" Malignus's chant faltered. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face. "Impossible. You are too weak, too far." "You underestimated the power of what you tried to break," Kalen snarled. A massive battle erupted as his warriors crashed into Malignus's shadow guards. The chamber became a whirlwind of flashing claws, dark magic, and roars of fury. Kalen ignored it all. His eyes were locked on Alara, on her pain. He fought his way toward her, a force of nature, cutting down any shadow creature that dared to stand in his path. Malignus recovered his composure, his shock turning to rage. "So you came to watch her die. Fine. I will sever the bond and break you before your very eyes." He redoubled his chant, pouring all his power into the ritual. The tearing sensation in Alara's soul became unbearable. The world went white with pain. She could feel Kalen falter, a cry of agony echoing from him as their bond was violently assaulted. Malignus seized the opportunity. He launched a spear of solidified shadow at Kaelin. The Alpha King, reeling from the feedback of the ritual, tried to dodge but was too slow. The spear pierced his shoulder, driving him to one knee. He grunted in pain, blood welling from the new wound. He looked up, his golden eyes meeting Alara's. He was hurt. He was fighting for her, bleeding for her, and he was losing. Seeing him fall, seeing his pain, did something to her. The stubborn ember of defiance she had nurtured for a lifetime roared into an inferno. The despair, the fear, the lifetime of being called worthless, all of it coalesced with a fierce, protective love for the man on his knees. And it all erupted into pure, incandescent rage, a power she never knew she possessed. A sleeping giant within her soul awoke. It was cold. Not the absence of heat, but an active, aggressive cold. The cold of the void between stars, absolute zero. A wave of visible frost exploded from her body. It shot across the ritual circle, the red line sizzling and vanishing under its touch. The dark magic of the severing ritual shattered like glass. The iron chains on her wrists became so brittle with cold, they cracked and fell away. The wave of frost washed over the chamber. Malignus's guards, the creatures of shadow, froze solid in an instant, their dark forms turning into brittle, crystalline statues before shattering into dust. Malignus himself threw up a shield of darkness, but the frost slammed into it, cracking and groaning under the pressure. He stared at her, his composure finally, utterly broken. His face was a mask of disbelief and fear. The pain of the bond vanished, replaced by a surging, humming current of immense power. It flowed from her, through her, a river of starlight and ice. The snowflake on her shoulder blazed with a light so bright it outshone the moon, bathing the entire chamber in its silver glow. She stood, no longer the shivering, terrified girl. Her eyes, she knew somehow, were no longer the dull brown of her past. They were glowing with the same silver light as the mark on her skin. She looked at Malignus, who was struggling to maintain his shield against the crushing cold she was emanating. "You called me a key," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, ringing command that echoed with the power of a blizzard. "You called me a prize. My own pack called me worthless." She took a step toward him, the stone floor frosting over with every footfall. "I am not a key," she declared, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I am not a prize, and I am not nothing." She raised a hand, and the air around Malignus crackled, shimmering with ice crystals. "I am Alara. I am the winter's heart, and you will never threaten my king again." With a final, furious cry, she clenched her fist. The frost around Malignus collapsed inward, not crushing him, but forming a prison of impossibly dense black ice. It was a tomb of eternal cold, silencing his screams and sealing his dark magic away forever. The battle was over. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the panting of Kaelin's warriors. The power receded, leaving her standing in the center of the ruined chamber, trembling from the sheer force of what she had just done. And then he was there. Kaelin was before her, his face a mess of awe, relief, and a love so profound it made her knees weak. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently cupping her cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, real. "My queen," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her against him, wrapping his strong arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "You saved me." She clung to him, the strength finally leaving her limbs. "You came for me," she whispered into his chest. "Always," he rumbled, his voice vibrating through her. "I would cross the abyss 1,000 times for you." He pulled back just enough to look at her. He gently touched the snowflake mark on her shoulder, which was now glowing with a soft, steady, peaceful light. "I told you, a fire hidden in the frost." "I don't understand," she said, looking at her own hands, which had just commanded the very essence of winter. "What is this power?" "It is yours," he said simply. "It has always been yours, dormant, waiting. The bond, the threat to me, it awoke what was sleeping. You are the other half of my soul, Ilara. My power is of the sun and the wild heart of the hunt. Yours is of the moon and the unyielding strength of winter. Together, we are balanced. Together, we are whole." As he spoke, he pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not fiery or demanding. It was a seal, a promise, a homecoming. As their lips met, a warmth spread from his chest. She felt a faint heat over his heart, and she knew, with the certainty of the bond, that a matching mark had just appeared on his skin, a golden sun, forever encircling her silver snowflake. She was no longer just claimed. She was claiming him in return. The bond was complete, a perfect, unbreakable circle. He lifted her into his arms, his wounds seemingly forgotten in the aftermath of the battle. "Let's go home," he said. They returned to his kingdom, a vast, majestic domain of snow-capped mountains and silver forests nestled under the light of the aurora. When Kaelin walked into the great hall of his palace, carrying her, his warriors following behind, a hush fell over the assembled court. He did not put her down. He walked to the twin thrones at the head of the hall, one of dark wood and gold, the other empty, made of what looked like pale, unmelting ice. He turned to face his people, his voice ringing with power and pride. "Behold!" he declared, his golden eyes sweeping over the crowd. "For centuries this throne has sat empty. The heart of our kingdom has been incomplete. No more." He looked down at her, his gaze softening. "I present to you Ilara, the winter's heart, my soulmate, my bondmate." He gently pushed back the fabric from her shoulder, revealing the brightly glowing snowflake mark for all to see. Gasps of awe and wonder rippled through the hall. "Your queen." He then gently placed her on the ice throne. It was not cold. To her, it felt like coming home, the power in it singing to the power in her veins. The entire court, hundreds of powerful, proud wolf shifters, the strongest of all the packs, dropped to one knee. In unison, they bowed their heads to her. Her, Ilara, the Omega, the worthless, the curse. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of overwhelming joy. Later, she stood with Kaelin on a high balcony overlooking the starlit kingdom. The cold air was crisp and clean, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a part of her. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her head. The steady, warm thrum of their completed bond was a constant, comforting presence in her soul. The tearing ache of loneliness she had lived with her entire life was gone, replaced by his unwavering strength and love. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her hair. She thought for a moment. She had been afraid her entire life, afraid of pain, of hunger, of dying, of being alone. But now, No, she whispered, and she was surprised to find that it was the absolute truth. She leaned back against his solid warmth, his presence a fortress around her. I'm not cold anymore. A gentle smile touched her lips, the first true, unguarded smile of her entire life. It felt like the sun rising after a long, dark winter. She was home. She was loved. She was queen. And for the first time, she truly believed she was worthy of it all.